My sharing this morning is from our gospel reading from Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through to 35. Now, here's a question, and I'm sure you will all respond positively to this. I wonder if you have ever been embarrassed by your children or your grandchildren. Immediately, I can see people smiling, shoulders chuckling. I'm sure most, if not all of us, have experienced that at some time or another. It's a bit like the mom who was cooking for some friends who were coming around the following evening. And she'd made a pasta sauce the day before, but she'd forgotten to put it in the fridge as she rushed out to work. And so it had been left on the kitchen counter in the sunshine for the whole day. So she gets home and suddenly realizes what's happened. Not enough time to make any more pasta sauce. So she decides to phone food hygiene and ask them what to do. Food hygiene, the lady on the end of the phone says, don't worry, boil the sauce for 10 minutes before serving and it'll be okay. So that's what she does. Well, later that evening, just as they all sat down to eat, the phone rang. And the lady's little 5-year-old daughter, who was quick on her feet, was up like a flash and answered the phone. And a couple of seconds later, she came back into the dining room and she said, "Mummy, it's the lady from food hygiene. Is the pasta sauce okay?" Embarrassed by our children. And in many ways, that's what we see just below the surface here in our reading from Mark's Gospel. Jesus' family, his mother and his brothers come to take him home because they are embarrassed by what he is doing and what he is saying. We see that in verse 21. Mark tells us that his family had heard some of the things he was saying, and they were aware of the things he was doing. And so they go and try to rein him in. They apologize for him, and they say he's out of his mind. They are embarrassed. If you remember, through Mark's Gospel, Jesus' ministry to this point, he'd been challenging the authority of the religious leaders. He had started to challenge that voice of the institution which said, this is the only way to God. You can be in, you are out. This is how you've got to do it. This is what you have to do. This is how you have to live. And we're the ones to tell you. And Jesus, in effect, was saying, rubbish, absolute rubbish. God does not demand all of that constraint and straitjacket of rules and regulations. He does not want that or need that before you can love him or before he can love you. He loves you already, and he longs for you to love him with all of yourself and to love your neighbor as you want yourself to be loved. And because of this challenge, this threat, we see the reaction of the religious leaders, of the institution. And it's a reaction, interestingly, that we will still see today when an institution or powerful individual is challenged. Just think back to some of the issues surrounding the Conservative government in England and Dominic Cummings. The institution seeks to demonize the voice or the challenge or the threat. Don't worry about him. He's mad. The religious leaders say to the crowds, he's possessed. His family say, he's mad. And we can imagine, as the religious leaders seek to silence Jesus, what they're trying to do is work out how far this has spread, where these ideas have come from, and so they want to know what his family think. Do his family agree? Which side are they on? And so the pressure is on his mother and his brothers. Where do they stand? So they feel the heat too. And what we see is this challenge that Jesus makes, this focus of attention towards Jesus from the religious authorities, actually looks toward or focuses also upon his family. You might remember the crowds have already said, who is this Jesus? Isn't he just the carpenter? Isn't he just Mary's son? Aren't his brothers here with us? And so what we see at this point in the ministry of Jesus is that what he is saying and doing is making his family feel uncomfortable. It's drawing attention to them, and they are embarrassed. They might even have been ashamed. They come to take him saying, we're really sorry, but he's out of his mind. And it made me think, I wonder, how do we react? How do we feel when what Jesus says or does causes others to take offense? And we find that directed towards ourselves. Love your enemy. Give to those in need. Don't store up treasure here on earth. You must be born again. How do we feel when people say, why? Or no? Or you must be mad. Don't tell me how to live. Or how do we respond when someone says to you, you go to church, you call yourself a Christian, so why do you do that? Or what do you think about this? And suddenly, like Jesus' family, we can find ourselves starting to feel the heat. Maybe we suddenly don't like the attention. We feel embarrassed. And maybe not with our words, but maybe with our thoughts and our actions, we find ourselves reacting like Jesus' family back then. Maybe this teaching is out of touch. Well, it might have worked back in the day when life was simple, but today, if I did that, people might think I've lost the plot. Give 1/10 of your income, care for the poor, love your enemy, heal the sick. We just don't do those things today. And Jesus says to the crowd, who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? Who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? Now, Jesus here isn't sort of casting off or showing a lack of care for his mother. We see that through the Gospels, particularly and very poignantly when Christ on the cross says to John regarding his mother, here is your mother. He shows an ongoing care for her by placing her within family and not leaving her on her own. But what we do see Jesus doing with those words to the people around him is challenging them that if they want to be his disciples, if they're going to call themselves Christians, if they want to be followers of Christ, part of God's family, then we must see our relationship with God, our life lived for God, as our priority. And that means not just a private inner relationship that we can hide from others, that we can wheel out on Sundays, but then just sort of pack it away neatly for the rest of the week so it doesn't have to engage with issues and controversies and so feel embarrassed or under pressure. Rather, Jesus says, whoever does God's will, whoever follows the example of Christ, loving your enemies, healing the sick, welcoming the poor and the homeless, engaging with social issues of justice and mercy and so on, whoever does these things day by day, moment by moment, living a life after the example of Christ, whoever does these things, living a life that might just draw attention, that might just challenge others, living a life that does those things that might occasionally make us feel a little bit embarrassed, that might well bring us into conflict or confrontation with others, certainly into debate. Asking people if we can pray for them, challenging people on their attitude toward creation, toward their neighbor, offering our tithe as an act of worship. You get the idea. Whoever does these things is my mother and my brothers and my sisters. And Mark doesn't record it, but I guess we can draw the inference. And whoever does not. I wonder if we ever feel embarrassed by some of the things that Jesus says or does, by some of the things he calls us to say and do. Because the challenge that Mark records, that Jesus presents, if we were to flip forwards a couple of chapters, we see it there. For if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this generation, then I will be ashamed of them when I come in my glory. Amen.